this is my status update for winter 2020 for the project Scaffolded exercises. So, for a bit of context, Scaffolded Exercises is a project meant to create learning resources for intermediate developers from professional front end JavaScript. And kind of the learning goals of creating from these learning resources is that intermediate developer will know how data flows or how values change through a program's execution. The learning resources should demonstrate the connections between different code components that make up the larger complex program. They should teach professional development patterns so that folks are learning real skills for development and not just kind of boilerplate or more simplistic patterns. And finally, it should help developers build knowledge incrementally so that they can kind of stitch together their knowledge from smaller pieces so they never feel overwhelmed, but are able to gain the large amount of knowledge that is required for building a professional program. So I have built an interface prototype. I did that last quarter, and this quarter I was narrowing in on a system to support my interface. So yeah, by the end of fall quarter, the beginning of winter quarter, I had developed a prototype. I had run a 10-person study, and I had submitted my extended abstract based on that prototype and that study to SRC. And that allowed me, that process of actually writing out my understanding of my project at the time allowed me to identify shortcomings in my system understanding. And I found it really hard to write my extended abstract actually because I was concerned about the lack of a system model and I didn't have any sort of technical contribution. And I wasn't sure that my proposed solution was extensible because I had no system to support it. So what I was able to do this winter was work on my system arguments, my system model, and then my system implementation. So a system to actually support my interface. So I identified two pieces that were necessary in a system to support my interface, and that was variable value tracking and code breakdown and exercise ordering. So the system needs to be able to track variable values so that you can see the value of program variables as the page changes in response to user interaction. And the idea there is that we can connect visual intuition to like technical implementation. And a really good way to do that is to see how data values are changing as the visual indication or the visuals of a page are also changing. So the second thing, though, code breakdown and exercise ordering is that the system needs a way to break down the code into smaller components, which like this is an example of a smaller component or a chunk that I call it, like a code chunk. And then those chunks need to be sequenced to help intermediate developers incrementally build that understanding, like I was explaining before. So how did I come to that? And then how did I come to possible solutions for those issues? So to even understand what, if anything, I needed to build, I had to conduct some of this need finding and investigating that. And beyond identifying the gaps in my understanding while writing my extended abstract, I was also able to delve really deeply into related work during the writing process. And this was very helpful for when it came time to work on my system because I went back to other projects to see the technical approach and how I could tailor those technical approaches to work for my system problems at hand. For example, I spent a good amount of time looking into Isoplex code to understand how the nodes were created and categorized in their different types, like, for example, setup code or a DOM node or something like that. And this helped me understand what was already possible and what had already been implemented, and then where I had to actually develop solutions on my own. So, also, because there were so many different options, like technically different possible solutions, I made a habit of testing out different tools and possible solutions as quickly as possible. So, for example, Gobi encouraged me to post my idea for local variable value tracking into some public forums to get feedback from other developers. And I was able to get some really helpful responses on Stack Overflow, actually, that pointed me to tools that were possibly helpful. And it also helped me rule out some implementation options, which was really necessary. Finally, for my status update, I'll get into this a little bit later, but I presented my idea for an algorithm for the code breakdown or exercise ordering portion of my system, which gave me about 20 minutes to give enough context on my project and be able to explain the algorithm such that someone who is not a part of my project could give me feedback on it. And preparing for this forced me to get as detailed in my understanding and ability to articulate my system as possible. And the remaining questions that still came after that were really helpful for me as I tried to finalize what my system arguments would look like for this part of my system. So, as I mentioned, the first component of my system was that variable value tracking. And how I did this was I use abstract syntax trees, which basically think of um, a program as a series of nodes. So, you can almost think of your program as like a tree art structure. Um, and using that, I'm able to traverse through the abstract syntax trees to find variable declarations and value changes and updates. So this is a kind of what the initialized program global state manager looks like. And now I'm actually working, this is kind of a utility thing, but I'm working to make access of the values easier because this screenshot is showing how the map populates with the nodes that are doing the value setting and update. And I also want to be able to get the actual value of those variables really quickly, which I can do with a little bit more traversal, but I want to make it even easier. So like tile size, for example, is a literal, and you can see how easy it is to get here. But size is a array, and it'd be really nice both to have, this is the node that actually created this update. Um, or that actually initialize the size variable, but I also want to be able to have access to the actual values here. So that's a small utility thing that I want to work on. Then the second component was the code breakdown and exercise ordering. So as I mentioned before, I presented this logic to the class. And I also actually recorded a video with a similar explanation, and I've posted it to the Scaffolded exercises playlists on the DTR YouTube. So I won't get into the technical details here, but basically the idea is that there are different kinds of nodes, and you prefer different kinds of nodes as they refer to DOM objects in different orders in order to create like your overall exercise ordering. In order to test it, I also updated my prototype manually and conducted a user test to see whether the learner was still able to achieve the ideal learning outcomes with the updated exercise ordering. That was based only on my technical implementation or of my proposed technical implementation. And while I only tested one person, she was still able to articulate all the important things I had looked for in last quarter's user test. So that's a really good sign that this algorithm is able to support the interface. This system is able to support the interface. And I haven't been able to finish implementing this part, but I will be using, and I am using a lot of the abstract syntax tree things similar to what I worked on for variable value tracking. And since I have such a detailed English algorithm, I feel confident about my ability to finish translating this algorithm into code. So, based on kind of what I've worked on and what I'm hoping to finish in terms of technical implementation for component two, my next steps are going to be to finish. So, after I finish that implementation, I want to be able to test my system functionality, and then I want to continue to work to articulate the research concept. So, what was so helpful for kind of my research abilities and also furthering my project was writing out what I was trying to say or what I believed my project was able to do. Um, and so that's something that I want to continue doing next quarter. So as I'm testing my system functionality, thinking about ways that I can actually present that work, whether it be submitting again or something else, I think is going to be really beneficial both for the project and also for my growth. So that was the quarter in DTR and more to come next quarter.